webinar number 4. I'm very excited that we still have a crew that has hung in this long. You know, this is a series of 6, and this is number 4. We're very excited that today we're going to be focusing on the role of shared decision-making in advancing recovery. Very exciting topic. I think you're going to be kind of ready for a wild ride. We've got some great information to share with you. Rick Gosha will be one of our experts, and you know him well if you've been on the previous webinars. And also from his agency is Kelly Spencer, who's a consultant and trainer from his agency, and we'll talk a bit more about Kelly's background. And let me go through some of the nuts and bolts. So as usual, there are CEs available, and we now have new and additional staff in our continuing education department, and so our ability to be more timely in getting you this material is improved. But again, as you have in the past, if you want the CEs, you need to indicate through the question box who it is that wants those CEs and include the email address so we have a means of communicating with you. You've got to do it within the first 15 minutes of the session. That's not new. And then, of course, you need to attend the entire session. And then at the end, we will send you the packet. So we're getting caught up, but things should be much speedier in the future now that we've got our staff vacancies filled. And if you have any questions in general today and are struggling with the technology, please go ahead and either chat to Sharon in the email, the chat service here, or you can send her an email at the address here on the screen. Let's talk about the agenda. So session 4, as we talked about, is about shared decision making, although we're going to go ahead and do a brief check-in on the Personal Recovery Plan, or PRP, just to see if folks have got any questions about that, or maybe hopefully even gave it a try and have some things to share about it. Then Rick is going to talk about what shared decision making is, and also in a very interesting way what shared decision making is not. And create a clear understanding of its relevancy to the work that we do in supporting recovery. And then we're going to shift over to Kelly, who's going to talk about how do you use shared decision-making processes, what do they look like, and how they become part of your day-to-day. And Rick will wrap up with a summary, and then we'll talk about next steps and adjourn at 1:30. Just as a reminder, we have the Strengths Model Practice Orientation Scale, which we're going to be talking about in depth in session 6, so we really recommend that you be completing that either as you go or in anticipation of session 6. So the shared decision making is a factor that's woven throughout these items, so there's not one in particular that we're addressing today, but it's central to the strengths model practice. And at this point, reminder about who Rick Gosha is as the director of the Kansas Center of Mental Health Research and Innovation and co-author of the Strengths Model, co-developer of the Strengths Model. He's been instrumental for us in this series of sessions, as well as for years in California, supporting learning collaboratives and the training and teaching around the Strengths Model. We're very excited to continue to have his support, and you'll hear more about his background just as he describes this material. So Rick, turning it over to you. Oh, and actually before we do that, real quick, Kelly, who I mentioned earlier, is going to follow Rick after he's been doing the overview of shared decision making, and you see a little bit of background about her, but she's really very skillful both in practice and in training around shared decision making amongst very many other evidence-based practices and emerging practices. So with that said, Rick, I will hand it to you.
Very good. Thanks, Karen. Well, last webinar that we had, the focus was on the personal recovery plan, and I want you to see that the personal recovery plan is basically a companion tool to the strengths assessment in the strengths model, and really you kind of don't do one without the other, because it's not really good to, in a sense, help people to kind of think about what's meaningful and important in their life if you're not going to help people then also to make progress towards that. So while the strengths assessment is intended to help people understand what is meaningful and important to people, the personal recovery plan is organized to help people make movement towards building the life that they want. And so the personal recovery plan, as we explained before, is not intended to be a replacement for the treatment plan, which should provide a broader roadmap of where people want to go, but it truly is this shared agenda roadmap ground level tool that's used to help people navigate this overall terrain of recovery, and then also to make decisions that will impact the direction of their recovery journey. So before we get into shared decision making, I just want to kind of touch base and just see, does anyone have any very specific questions to the personal recovery plan that was kind of left over from last session, or even anyone who tried it out with somebody and would like to share that?
So Rick, I'm monitoring the question box. If there's anybody that would like to share some experience, let us know through the question box. We can take you off of mute, or I can just read whatever you have to say. Okay, Rick, I'm just trying to monitor the questions here. I don't think I see any at this point.
Okay, and also, like what we did before with the strengths assessment webinar, that we even welcomed people that wanted to submit questions even after the webinar, and we can do the exact same thing with the personal recovery plan, or even today with shared decision making, because we want to keep this dialogue kind of going forward and not making it just about the webinar itself, but how we kind of build a dialogue about how all these things fit together. So please feel free to share or to write in questions either through the webinar today, or even to submit those afterwards, and Karen will give you information about how you can do that even afterwards. So shared decision making, what is it and when do you use it? Well, just to give a little bit of background on shared decision making, it really started gaining its prominence in the area of physical health care in around the 1980s, and primarily as an alternative to paternalistic forms of decision making. And yet, despite the attention that's really been given to the philosophy of doing shared decision making with physical health conditions, but now also in mental health care, there remains a lack of clear guidance on exactly how do you accomplish shared decision making in actual practice. But even with that, there are some common elements that kind of find its way through any discussion of shared decision making. And those elements would include a two-way exchange of information between the healthcare provider and the client, an exploration of options, including potential pros and cons associated with each, an element of choice among the various options, and then ultimately a robust conversation about what fits best for the person in terms of their values and preferences. And then all this would lead to a collaborative decision. So shared decision making isn't just a set of processes that we put into place. Just like when we talked about like the strengths assessment or the personal recovery plan, it also requires us as helping professionals to sometimes make some significant philosophical shifts. So one of those is that it requires us to view every encounter that we have with a person as being filled with multiple potential important decisions that could impact that person's life. Even decisions that we may think are small can have huge ramifications for the people that we serve. So we always need to hold these decision points with the ultimate highest regard. A second thing is that we must always believe that there are two experts in the room. And while we bring our professional knowledge about services, treatments, tools, interventions, and even community resources, we also need to recognize that people bring an expertise about their lived experience of mental illness, and their desires, their aspirations, their fears, their hopes, their dreams, preferences, and even their values. And while all people may not be accustomed to shared decision making and have various comfort levels with making decisions, we have to start with the belief that all people do want some say in the decisions that impact their life, and that they're capable at varying levels of being involved in those decisions. And the variation that people desire or feel comfortable with playing an integral role in decision making varies as much as it does for any of us when interacting with healthcare professionals. And then lastly, and maybe most importantly, is we need to be able to let go of some of the power that's been transferred or even resigned over to us as mental health professionals over time. And so this kind of stance towards decision making will require us to understand that for people to truly recover, they need to be able to take some ownership of their recovery journey, and that no matter what people decide, we can't take any of this as a personal affront to our position as professionals. And so those are some things that I think that it requires as just a baseline. So where does shared decision-making fit within the context of strengths model practice? Everywhere. You know, from the point of contact that we have with a person, there are decisions that are occurring. And even when that first contact may evolve around a crisis or a point where a person's overwhelmed with life or specific symptoms, we can even at that point begin creating an environment where people feel that they have choices, and even if that choice is just not to decide any choice at that time. But in strengths model practice, what you'll see as we kind of go along through this webinar is that it fits everywhere from engagement to how we use the tools. The strengths assessment, the personal recovery plan are all filled with opportunities to do shared decision making. And as we continually to help people basically express their narratives and make progress towards their recovery, they're all filled with opportunities for shared decision making, which should be exploited at any opportunity. For many people, this is going to demand that we exercise some patience, because some people have not always been accustomed to experiencing choice and autonomy when it comes to mental health care decisions. But to get there, the change really must occur with us first. We need to recognize expertise even in the midst of working with people who may not see themselves as experts, or even previously we may not have experienced them as experts. And we must recognize that it's the people we serve that are essential to understanding what is meaningful and important in their lives. And we can't really have truly centered, client-centered goals without drawing upon this experience. And even though it's important for us to work within a context of medical necessity, we also have to recognize that the people we serve own an experience, an expertise of their experience of their illness or condition or whatever they experience in their life that we have no access to without them, as well as their perspective of what's getting in the way of them making progress towards recovery. And ultimately, no matter what we think about the effectiveness of our services, treatments, our interventions, the people we serve hold a power to define what is helpful to them and what is not. And even though we may paint an elaborate portrait of a person's strengths via the strengths assessment and clearly see a person's potential, you know, it's the person who ultimately holds the power to exercise the application of those strengths towards achieving meaningful and important goals, or even removing barriers to these goals. Which is why the concept of finding alignment is critical to not only the strengths model practice, but also to shared decision making. So each encounter with a person is basically a set of negotiations. And the strengths model recognizes as one of its key principles, we talked about this in the very first webinar, that people are the director of the helping process. And this doesn't mean that the worker does exactly what the person wants in every situation, but it does mean that we are continuously looking for alignments where we have a role in helping people achieve a life of meaning, purpose, and identity. And so our documentation then becomes a written testimonial to how these decisions were made in this evolving storyline of a person's recovery journey. So in this webinar, we're going to talk about shared decision making. But before we get to practical applications of shared decision making when working with people, we need to look at how decision making can inadvertently play out in the absence of focusing on the elements of shared decision making. So with this in mind, I'm going to talk about coerced decision making. And while few of us would knowingly endorse the widespread use of practices using coercion, it does happen. And even though I consider myself having been a strengths-based, recovery-oriented practitioner who highly values shared decision-making, you know, I've still unintentionally engaged in decision-making that drew upon subtle forms of coercion. But I do need to make a disclaimer before I proceed on to the next set of slides that I'm not advocating for the use of coerced decision-making. But it really is important for us to understand the subtle dynamics that are involved in coerced decisions so that we can watch for it. And most importantly, by understanding these dynamics, we can better understand what it takes to do true shared decision-making. So I'm bringing out these things not to, in a sense, say that these things are the way to do it, but to kind of really show how these things can potentially develop even if we are aware of it or not. You know, when people typically think of coercion, we think of methods that apply force or even in some case potential violence. And these are valid definitions of coercion. They're extreme forms and usually fairly easy to recognize. But coercion can also occur when people have the best of intentions, because even when we unintentionally compel people to a certain action or make a specific choice, this is a form of coercion, even if the intention was not to coerce. You know, in our last webinar when we were discussing goal planning, we had this section that was titled Why Goals Are Not Achieved. And at that point we focused primarily on why some people don't follow through on goals that we thought were important to them. And one of the reasons we mentioned was that it is possible that the goal wasn't theirs in the first place. But what about the people who do follow through with goals that aren't theirs? It can be tempting for us to think that that their follow through confirms on some level that they want to do it, but here's where we need to be very careful. So let's talk a little bit about what is needed to coerce somebody to do something, even subtle coercion. For coercion to happen, first we have to possess something or have access to something a person wants, or have the power to take away something a person wants to keep. So this could be access to housing or services or entitlements. It could be that we offer stability for a person during a time when the person feels like their life's out of control, or we offer support to somebody that they need when they have nobody else around them. But in addition to that, it also requires that the person perceive that there are no other viable or preferable options to access it, what they want, or prevent losing something. And so while there are some clients who decide not to take us up on our offers for help, there are also clients who will accept things that they don't want or need to preserve something that they do want. So we must be aware of these dynamics because they're ripe for forms of subtle coercion, and once again, whether we intend it or not. So, and let's see, let me go back here. Sometimes we confuse persuasion with forms of subtle coercion. You know, but in persuasion, we're trying to get a person to see something from our vantage point. And so if a person comes to some understanding that we're making valid points, they recognize that somebody's saying something that makes sense, then they may be persuaded to take some action because of that. But persuasion always implies that we have an ability to choose. You know, if you think about it, I'm trying to persuade you right now through these webinars that practicing from a strengths model orientation has merit as an effective way to deliver recovery-oriented mental health services. But you all retain the power once you get off this webinar to do whatever you want. So you could all go back and you can say, oh, that was interesting, but it was completely silly. You possess that power. Coercion, on the other hand, only requires power. You don't even need understanding. So an example, if I decide to issue a consequence for something any of my 4 children might do, I may like to invoke a phrase such as, you know, do you understand what I'm trying to say, or I'm trying to teach you? But it really doesn't require their understanding at all. You know, if I have the power to do something, you know, like access to their phone or video games or a certain freedom, and they perceive they have no other choice but to accept the consequence, then it's not persuasion. Similarly, we might make arguments of what a certain decision might be better for the people that we serve. But the fact that we have power, whether because of our position or because of what we might have access to, this can be a filter through which the people we serve may weigh a particular decision. So to kind of further make this point, is there anything that we can learn from sales? You know, each of us at some point have probably been in a position to make a major decision regarding a purchase that we were nervous about making. And if we assume for a moment that the majority of salespeople are not evil, malicious human beings, then we can understand some of the dynamics involved in why we make some of the purchasing decisions we do. Now, just from my own experience, I actually spent a very small portion of my time in life doing some sales, and I had really mixed results. And mostly because I was too honest with people about options, which on several occasions led me to pointing people in the direction of a competitor's product. But if I would have understood these dynamics I'm talking to you right now better at that time, you never know, maybe I could have made a little bit of money off of it. But what are some of these dynamics that could be used in sales that can be used in a sense to help people, or not to help people, but in a sense to influence decisions? Some of these things are a question from the point of the person who's doing the selling, such as how much does the person know about what they want? So from a sales perspective, the less a person knows about what they want, the more liberty that we have to actually help them shape their preferences. But to do that, we need to know the active ingredient that they're looking for. And I've watched this dynamic play out when I've taken my son to go buy a new pair of shoes. And we go out there, and he may not exactly know what shoe he wants, but once they find out that the active ingredient is that he wants to look cool, we always get directed first to the semi-cool section of the shoe store, and then finally we get to the point where we look at the shoes that for only X amount of dollars more put him in the top 10% of cool. And so they're kind of weighing that against, like, well, okay, well, how much would, how much is dad invested in helping his son be cool, and they put lots of pressure and stuff on me. But looking for that active ingredient is really important. And then the next two questions that are up there are very closely aligned. Do we like the person, and to what degree do we think that they know what they're talking about? For me, I know very little about home repair stuff except for the very basics. So whenever something goes majorly wrong at my house, I'm fairly easy prey. So when I have people come out for estimates on some kind of home repair kind of thing, I typically end up going with the person I like the most, and who also seems to know what they're talking about. Sometimes though, unfortunately, several $100s later, I find out that I didn't always make the best choice. So a last element is how much the person knows about other options. You're all going to start thinking that basically I'm easy prey for everything, but if you're out there shopping for computers and you decide to go into a particular place, either because you think it's the go-to place to get computers, or just something that you're familiar with, you may or may not know if they're selling the top computer in a certain price range, or the number 7 rated computer in Consumer Reports in that price range. And if I don't know that there's a better deal for the same amount of money only a mile away, there's a chance that I might take that product without doing further research. So how does all this apply to mental health? Well, these dynamics can be in play for a lot of people that we serve, especially when we're working with people who may not be completely clear about what they want in their life. They like us, they trust us, and they're not completely clear about the multitude of options to accomplish any given goal, or even understand about how they might be able to achieve an active ingredient they want, or maybe even not having awareness of those kind of things. So what I want you to take away, at least at this point here, is that as we begin talking about shared decision making, we just need to be aware of dynamics that might be at play when clients are making decisions about anything that impacts their life. And this is important for when we kind of get into shared decision making. So what are just some examples of where sometimes subtle coercion can occur? Once again, not necessarily that we intend to do those things, but if we remember Elizabeth, who we discussed in our very first webinar, initially she only took medications because her mom wouldn't let her live at home unless she did. And so her fear of being homeless, because she'd experienced that before, she'd experienced loss of freedoms because of hospitalization, and also just a desire to have support from her mom, who she kind of viewed as one of the few people that actually cared about her, that really outweighed any negative view that she had of medications. So she didn't take medications because she thought that they were helpful or that she thought that she needed them, but those were dynamics that led to why she did take medications. And there was lots of other reasons of why she even engaged in certain mental health services. You know, she was looking for an active ingredient, and she would take things that she didn't want just so that she could have other things that she wanted. So there's lots of other examples, you know, like for example, when people may accept a specific service from our agency, but not necessarily wanting that because but only because it's tied to something else. And you know, when I was doing case management work, I was initially very perplexed about why so many people went to psychosocial groups, even though I heard, you know, continuous complaints about how they hated to go to groups or that they found that some of the groups were unhelpful. But then when I understood that psychosocial groups were tied to some people's housing arrangements, well, then this became very clear. And the same thing actually applied to people who accepted payee services from our agency that I worked for. You know, one thing that really made a difference for me in starting to think about how people make decisions was an experience that, you know, that I've had in case management. You know, as a case manager, I've unintentionally got clients to work on goals that I found out later that they really didn't want to work on. And one of my most kind of profound stories that really shaped me, even still to this day, was a woman who I worked with, who I'll call Carol, who said that we were doing the strengths assessment, and she just said that she had thought about going back to work. You know, well, for me, it's like that just sent off all kinds of bells and whistles of happiness and joy, and so it got me really excited. And I think that the more that I got excited, the more that she got excited about the goal. So we put it on a treatment plan. We started using the personal recovery plan to take some steps. We used our strengths assessment to get ideas for possible job matches. I took it at one point to group supervision to get additional ideas about what might be employment possibilities. She picked up some places, or she chose some places that we went up and picked up some applications. We were filling them out at her house, and we even got to the point that we were doing role plays of how you might do a job interview. And then one day we're out to turn in one of the applications that she filled out, and she starts tearing up in the car. And I just noticed, you know, the tear kind of going down her cheek, and I asked Carol, I said, you know, what's wrong? And she said, I really don't want to work. And I was just kind of floored, and I was, you know, why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell me this earlier? And her answer was, you know, I thought you wanted me to work, and I really didn't want to let you down. So that was kind of like a wow statement for me, and you know, kind of not really in a sense realizing some of the power that I did have to impact somebody's direction that they might go. So that particular scenario was a major shift for me in shared decision making, because I now realized that I couldn't always trust my own insight into why people may make certain decisions. So as we're starting to now moving towards shared decision making, you know, it brings another kind of urgency to understanding what people want before we start with shared decision making, which plays into why it's important to take time when we're doing a strengths assessment and make sure we're very clear about why people may want to do something before we start racing along with a personal recovery plan. And all of these things are very valid reasons. You know, it can be very things tangible about where, you know, the person is saying that, or they agree to lots of other things, but it's really housing that they want. Or for some people, just immediate safety or stability. One thing that's really important that I really saw, and I see this play out in a lot of different mental health centers, are where the primary thing that people want is sometimes relationship or connection. So the thing that they really want sometimes is us. So people are a lot of times very willing to agree to a goal that goes on the treatment plan, or even a certain way of going about a goal because they value that relationship. Even sometimes this plays into, you know, why people may stay in mental health services rather than disengaging, because really the primary thing that's kind of locking them in there is that relationship and connection. You know, we've all seen before where people might do certain things to avoid something else or to avoid losing something, especially if you're dealing with people before that have experienced losing children or have lost freedoms, etc. Or even to get something specific where, you know, a person's primary goal is to get like an entitlement. You know, I want to get on benefits for immediate stability, security, etc. So it's important to understand what people really want. I'm going to skip over that and I'm going to come back. So as we're starting to talk about, you know, helping people not only, you know, develop goals that we might want to work on and think about which way we pursue, we always have to be aware of power dynamics. And, you know, there's power dynamics in any relationship. I mean, not just mental health worker and client, but I mean in any type of relationship. And you know, sometimes we mistakenly overuse power dynamics and not even realize it. I mean, it can be just in a spousal relationship or relationships with a parent and a child, or you know, work type relationship, etc. And so it's not to say that we'll ever be able to make power dynamics go away, nor do we have to completely get rid of power dynamics to be able to do shared decision making or even good mental health work. But we do have to be aware of it. And the more that we're aware of it, then the more effective that we can be at shared decision making. And we'll talk a little bit more later on, but there's lots of ways that you can even just now just start to become aware. And some of that is understanding what power dynamics might be in play when we're going out to meet with somebody. Or even taking the time after a meeting to kind of think about what decisions were made at a particular session, and you know why a person may have decided to do a certain thing. And so just taking these times and be aware, I think, are very important to kind of set up shared decision making. So another one is that there are times that power dynamics will be used in mental health. So you know, I want to make sure that everybody understands this, is that you know, it's not that power dynamics completely go away. You know, and it's not to say that there are situations that are never warranted, but it's important to be transparent, I think, with people when they can be invoked. You know, and having clarity about these things will be essential when engaging in shared decision making. So there are times, you know, when people are at imminent risk of danger to self or others that, you know, we may have to make a certain decision, you know, for a protection of a person, or even things that are tied to things like ethical decision making or licensing standards, where, you know, reporting of abuse, neglect, or other obligations to report based on our professional ethics. So these things all exist, but they're important to know, once again, is that these things are things that we do hold, and they're important to be transparent about these as much as possible when you're engaging in shared decision making. So with that, I just want to, I've thrown a lot of stuff out there very quick, so I wanted to stop now and just ask if people have any questions.
So Rick, I'm monitoring the questions being written in.
Okay.
And I am not seeing anything yet, but
was I that persuasive?
What's that?
Was I that persuasive?
Either that, or folks are in shock.
Or they're exercising power, yeah, and saying, you know.
Go.
So anyway, I'd love to hear some just people's reactions to that. It doesn't even necessarily even need to be a question, but just you know, did that particular discussion, before we actually go into the practical applications of shared decision making, does it, what kind of thoughts are you coming away with?
So let me just invite folks that while we're going to go on with the presentation now, any questions or comments that you have, please type them in, and at the end we'll try to revisit them and make sure that if we haven't answered those questions in the course of the next hour, that we do before we finish up. So please do tell us your thoughts. We think this is pretty provocative stuff, so we'd sure like to hear your reaction. And there's Lisa Godoy, thank you for sharing. She says, I don't have a question, but I did want to say that the sharing of the lady getting a job was very enlightening. Thank you for sharing your experience. So Rick, very useful practical experience that you had that you shared.
Yeah, we could actually do a whole a whole webinar on mistakes that I've made, and you know, I think it's important just to be aware of, you know, have those kind of experiences. I mean, I'm not saying that they're good, but the fact that we have those kind of really brings into point where, you know, that, you know, even unintentionally, we can sometimes invoke power dynamics that are not aware of. And it's just really important to kind of be aware of those things before we can really set kind of the terrain of being able to do real good shared decision making. It's just, it's a real gut check, but it's absolutely necessary, because even if we go in there with the language of shared decision making or the tools of shared decision making, we can still make the same mistakes. So thanks, Lisa.
Somebody else made a comment about the sound fading. Let us know if we are having a sound problem, but for now, let's go ahead and carry on.
Okay. So I'm gonna shift this over to Kelly Spencer now, and we're really going to kind of start talking about a practical example, and just like what we've done in the other webinars, is we're going to take this through an actual case scenario, something where, you know, one of us have actually worked with somebody and these things are coming out into play. And I really can't say enough about Kelly Spencer. I know it's easy for me to say these things because Kelly now works with us, but there was a time that Kelly didn't, and I had a lot of respect for what she was already doing out in one of the largest community mental health centers in our state. And, you know, in terms of implementing multiple practices like common ground, shared decision making, illness management, recovery, etc., is that she's done a lot of teaching, modeling, and shaping of how to do shared decision making with people at various levels. So not only working with prescribers or other medical staff, doing it with direct service workers and clients, but then also actually working directly with people with lived experience to kind of help them understand more about how they can be more involved in impacting decisions within mental health centers. So she's really hit it from a lot of different areas and has lots of great practical experiences. So Kelly, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Rick, so much. Rick talked about the fact that everyone with the person, every encounter with the person is filled with decisions. In fact, all of us make decisions every day outside of the context of our work in mental health. It's from the moment that we wake up to the moment we fall asleep, we are essentially making decisions. Some of these things may be major decisions for our lives, but each day is also filled with seemingly small decisions that, while can have a great impact on our day, aren't necessarily life-changing, such as, you know, what we're going to wear, where we're going to go, what we're going to eat, what we'll do, so on and so forth. But the question becomes, what about people receiving services? What are they making decisions about? And the truth is, they are making decisions that have the potential to profoundly impact their lives on multiple levels. And these are not just decisions on what to wear, what to eat, but incredibly personal decisions that have the ability to impact not just their health, but their overall ability to navigate the system while attempting to build a life outside of it. So I always think it's helpful if you can take a second and just try to imagine trying to maneuver that gauntlet, or the gauntlet of just everyday decisions, while maybe you're experiencing some potentially extreme states of being. Maybe you're also experiencing a crisis. Maybe you're having to make those very vulnerable, life-altering decisions in the span of 15 minutes. Which is indicative of most med clinic appointments, while others are trying to tell you what you need to do. If you think about all of those forces that someone experiences, would you be able to sort it out? Would you feel confident to speak up for yourself? Would you know which decision would be the best fit for your life? And how would our lives look if others had really shaped it for us? I know that I would probably not be here working this job facilitating this webinar if that was the case. I know that my life certainly wouldn't be my own, and I probably would not recognize my reflection in the mirror. The danger that exists when someone walks through the revolving doors of a mental health center is that there is this kind of general assumption that this is met with a relinquishing of their rights to make their own decisions, unintentionally silencing their expertise, and really developing treatment plans we think they need versus exploring what holds importance in regards to what they want. So what I'd like to do is actually introduce you to someone we will call Sawyer. Sawyer was a person in which decisions were made for him for a good portion of his life, which had a profound impact on his ability to move forward. Decisions that shaped his view of himself, what he was capable of, what his life looked like, so on and so forth. And I think it's important to know that shared decision-making was a new concept for Sawyer, but it was also new to the agency, his providers, his family. So while we're talking about the impact of shared decision-making on Sawyer, I think it's crucial to understand that shared decision-making wasn't something that just started happening at one point in time, right? You wave a wand and then all of a sudden we're all doing shared decision making. It didn't really work like that. It took time. But it occurred in the context of an agency that was struggling with aligning its behaviors with a philosophical view of recovery that they really believed. So all of these pieces had a great impact on not only Sawyer, but other people that were receiving services at this very community mental health center. So let's take a snapshot of the beginning of Sawyer's road to recovery back in 2008. He was the young man who was diagnosed with schizophrenia and autism. He was still living at home, had really limited supports outside his family. While he took medications, he experienced really life-altering side effects that got in the way of him being able to move forward with his life. And on the other side, while his family was happy that overall he seemed in a stable place, he was staying out of the hospital, for Sawyer it wasn't the life that he wanted. And the tension from this really resulted in frequent fights with family, with treatment staff, and really even himself internally. And his, quote, disruptive behaviors became kind of a confirmation to others that he was ill, that he needed the meds. So when he would abruptly go off the meds, he would be hospitalized, once again forced to take medications that really made him feel miserable. And what Sawyer really wanted was to have his own place and to work. And you can move forward, Rick, to the next one. For him, recovery would be having friends to do things with and not having to take medications. It is not that Sawyer wasn't distressed by the things we call mental illness. You know, he heard voices. He had difficulty sorting out his thoughts. He felt really extreme anxiety at times. But he also felt that the medications actually made these things worse. So it wasn't that Sawyer did not think he needed help, but he felt disillusioned that medications were the only option of help offered to him. And he felt that there had to be other options that better fit with his life and really the direction that he wanted his life to go. So fast forward 8 years, 2016, where's Sawyer today? Well, he moved out of his parents' house. He has his own apartment. He found a job, and what were once really limited supports that mainly consisted of his parents and the professionals in his life, now over time has really developed into a rich system of connections in the community. You know, he has friends to watch movies with. He plays in a recreation basketball league. He volunteers at his church. His family relationships have improved a great deal, and he spends time with them every single week. And for Sawyer, what was once a life kind of lived solely within the system, with the help of his treatment team and his family, you know, Sawyer now has a life worth living in areas that he is passionate about and niches within he excels in. And while this is a great end to the story, again, it's important to note that this story took over 8 years to occur. You know, it took multiple shifts at multiple levels for this to happen. And for the purpose of this webinar, I'm really going to hone in on 3 major shifts and how this played out not only for Sawyer, but also for his worker, his case manager, his parents, and his prescriber, and what they did to help create an environment where people can really begin to take more ownership and control of their own recovery journey. So a first shift occurred in how Sawyer viewed himself and how others viewed him. But I think it's also important to point out that all of these key players in Sawyer's life operated from a position of care and concern for Sawyer. Protecting Sawyer was important to these people, but although well-intentioned, it was this protection that unintentionally created more barriers for Sawyer to move forward in his journey. And it certainly wasn't Sawyer's fault. He didn't see himself as an expert, but once he was surrounded with the idea that his voice mattered and only he could define what recovery looked like for him, he really felt empowered to see himself as more than just a patient, but as a person with potential and a knowledge base no one else had in regards to himself. So essentially, Sawyer didn't know he was an expert until someone told him he was. He didn't feel heard until people started to listen. Sawyer's case manager really began a shift from more kind of passive practice to a place of very curious practice, and really in helping Sawyer develop his own narrative for his life, for his goals, his values, his beliefs. He surrounded him with the idea that he had choices and committed to Sawyer that they were going to actively explore all the possibilities that were out there for him. Once he began to focus really on the well aspects of Sawyer's life, this really allowed them to map their work out in regards to what Sawyer's goals were. You began to see their relationship change. You know, the work changed, the dialogue and conversations that they were having began to change. And I think it's just a reminder that every contact we have with people is a real opportunity to open up choices and decisions or ultimately shut them down. Sawyer's parents shifted in recognizing that they really weren't always going to be around for Sawyer to plan his life, to protect the son that they love so much. What it took was his parents seeing they could support him in taking healthy risks while they were still here so he could have a chance at the life Sawyer wanted for himself, and that ultimately they truly wanted for him too. Sawyer's prescriber shifted in realizing that Sawyer wasn't trying to be difficult or, quote, non-compliant, but he was not adhering to his medications for a number of valid reasons that were impacting his life on a number of levels. One of the tools that made this possible for the prescriber to shift was a decision support center the agency implemented where Sawyer could go prior to his appointment and fill out a very brief one-page how I am doing report. And this report really allowed Sawyer to plan for his appointment, track his concerns over time, and acted as an amplifier for Sawyer's voice to be heard by his prescriber. Once she saw that over a period of time, yes, he was reporting he was taking his meds, but he was also reporting the same concerns, while scores regarding his overall quality of life were continually declining. She became more willing to help, or really in clinical terms, assess the risk for Sawyer, and work alongside Sawyer to develop a safe plan to eventually get off medication in time. But the deal and the shared decision was they were going to actively identify other ways for Sawyer to stay safe and manage his wellness, especially once she understood that medications were really interfering with his overall recovery. Which leads us to a question of, well, why did Sawyer take his meds even though he didn't want to? Power dynamics. Because he liked his case manager loved his parents, and respected the authority of his prescriber. And, he also experienced many times losing freedom whenever he did try to go off his meds, because it always ended in hospitalization and a return to the same medications. Those in power had to transfer it to the person who needed it the most, and the person who needed it the most was Sawyer. The second shift follows medications and symptoms, and the shift for Sawyer happened by being surrounded with the possibility there were things he could do and use besides pill medication that promoted his wellness and really changed his biochemistry, per se, the same way medications would. Once Sawyer realized his family and prescriber were willing to help him develop a plan to move towards a medication-free life, if he would actively work with his case manager to identify those sources of wellness, that was really all the motivation Sawyer needed to start using and exploring his own personal medicine. And I'll talk more about the concept of personal medicine later. Sawyer's case manager shifted in understanding that medication was a potential tool and option among many in regards to Sawyer navigating his diagnosis of schizophrenia. I think the shift for the case manager really also entailed a great deal of reflecting on the case manager's part in regards to his personal judgments and beliefs regarding individuals with this diagnosis. While medication for some people can help regulate emotions, organize thoughts, feelings, it can't do the work of recovery for people. And so then there was the shift that emerged that their work really had a purpose and a pathway to kind of helping Sawyer identify what mattered in his life. What were the areas in his life that could give him the same benefits as, say, medication would. And I also think his case manager realized there was much from Sawyer he could learn in the process. I think it was this idea that Sawyer had just as much to offer him as he had to give in support to Sawyer that really allowed for this shift to occur. Our willingness to listen and learn about what is important to someone, regardless of how vastly different it is from our own truth and values, build trust and really a framework for our work in supporting people. Sawyer's parents and prescriber actually had a very similar shift in what they saw as a problem, meaning the voices, wasn't a problem for Sawyer. In fact, he often shared that the voices kept him company, made him laugh, but it was when he was on medications that the voices got worse. They were also very willing to explore the possibility that the medications were interfering with his life goals. He couldn't stay awake to explore finding work. He gained a significant amount of weight that left him feeling exhausted and tired all the time. And he couldn't focus on making friends because he was being bombarded with voices that got worse when he was on medication. The final shift is related to Sawyer's goals. Sawyer realized that what he wanted was possible because the supports in his life finally aligned themselves with it. He felt heard, he felt validated, he felt possibility. And it was this hope and support that really became a driving force in paving the way for Sawyer to move away from most mental health services down the road. Sawyer's case manager saw that there were limits with what the system could provide, and really began to see the community itself as limitless with possibilities, with resources, with places Sawyer could go develop relationships with people who really wanted to be invested in his life and be a part of his recovery. When the case manager stopped getting reports about how Sawyer was sleeping through support groups all day at the mental health center, and instead heard how Sawyer won second place in a basketball tournament halfway across the state, being the team's leading scorer, it was instances like this that all the more reinforced his case manager's shift and ultimately opened up more possibilities for people on this case manager's workload. His parents shifted in seeing that Sawyer was going to have to make some decisions someday without them. So why delay the process and Sawyer's potential really any further? They protected him for so long because they loved him so dearly. And I think it was ultimately their love that allowed them to let go so he could have the same opportunities just like his sister and have a chance at stepping out of his comfort zone and taking some steps that would need to happen if he wanted to get the life he wanted for himself. His prescribers shifted in seeing that medications sometimes aren't a piece of the puzzle for everyone, and that if people's concerns regarding medications aren't addressed or are interfering with an individual's life vision, their well-being, not being explored in collaboration, all of these things will lead to non-adherence eventually. So why not work with people to develop next steps in treatment that take them closer to recovery, not necessarily further from it? What I'd like to do now is actually spell out what the process of shared decision-making looks like in 3 different steps. The first one we'll look at is goal and value statements. Then we'll get into blending expertise, followed by weighing the options, and all 3 of those things lead to shared decision-making. So the first step is understanding what someone wants and why it's important to the person. The value statement really sends a clear message to the treatment team regarding what's at stake for the person. And both the goal and the value statement help guide the prescriber's medication treatment plan in order to avoid decisions or medications that may interfere with the person's recovery goals. So for instance, one of Sawyer's goals was to work. The medication that he was on was actually working in opposition to his ability to find work because it made him so tired he couldn't get up in the morning. He slept through his alarm. He couldn't stay awake throughout the day. So the medication was actually working against Sawyer's recovery. When Sawyer's parents heard his goal and his value statement, and vice versa, when Sawyer heard his parents' goal and value statement, it was very clear that what they all wanted was very similar. There was common ground in that Sawyer wanted a better life that included his family being involved in it, and Sawyer's family wanted help to get their son back. So when this exchange dialogue happened and included the prescriber's goal, it actually improved communication and created a shared agenda that everyone was on board with. The psychiatrist's goal and value statement, and remember here that the key word is willing. Remember, this didn't happen overnight. But the prescriber was willing to work on a plan that promoted Sawyer's well-being and lessened the risk of future harm. When she heard Sawyer share his value statement, she recognized that the current course of treatment was actually hindering his well-being and creating physical harm to his body. You know, he gained a substantial amount of weight on medications and was actually getting closer to the threshold of early stages of diabetes. So it made sense to her within this context to address his concerns, develop a plan, and really strategically monitor his progress. The second step in regards to Sawyer's shared decision-making process was this idea of blending and bringing the expertise of all parties to the forefront of treatment. So for Sawyer, you know, the voices weren't a problem as others thought they were for him. And in fact, he often shared what he needed the most help with was ways to get out of his head and feel more at ease around people. And it was also really clear that Sawyer was reporting the medications were making his symptoms worse. The voices got mean, they bullied him when he was on medications, and this actually created more internal struggles for Sawyer in being able to sort out his thoughts and lessen the tension with his family. Sawyer's parents' expertise was met with this very interesting wave of ambivalence, and they wanted him to be on medications because seeing him respond and interact with voices, although not a problem for Sawyer, was hard for them. But what they noticed was that when Sawyer was on medication, yes, he didn't outwardly engage with his voices as much, but he kind of checked out from life. He was lethargic, he was less animated, he often slept through most days, and really that in turn didn't give him their son back. The psychiatrist's expertise came with the knowledge of mental illnesses and medications. that were really best suited for a variety of disorders. So the prescriber also saw that Sawyer was interacting less with voices, and because of this initially believed that, treatment has proven effective. But as the agency began to evolve its practice and culture around shared decision making, the prescriber began to recognize that Sawyer was reporting consistent concerns regarding side effects and saying over and over within the health report that this med is not helpful. Yes, he was experiencing less voices, but at a cost. He was reporting they were getting worse. He was interacting less in life. He was experiencing debilitating side effects. And I think that helped the prescriber see that although many antipsychotic medications have side effects, sometimes side effects have the ability to be life-altering and be more debilitating than the diagnosis itself. And so it was the decision support tool that really helped the prescriber make recommendations from her expertise that fell in line with what Sawyer wanted in his expertise. The third step in the shared decision-making process was to begin weighing the options. There's numerous pathways people can explore, numerous combination of routes an individual can take to promote their recovery. And as Sawyer really began to weigh the options of medications, it became increasingly clear that for Sawyer, there were far more cons than there were pros. And exploring other sources of wellness matched Sawyer's parents' desire to see him continue to grow. But as parents, they wanted proof that Sawyer was feeling and doing better. On the other side, the psychiatrist was willing to explore those options with Sawyer, but wanted to develop a very detailed plan prior to beginning the process of tapering off medications that Sawyer could use daily to reference and incorporate wellness strategies into his life via the support of his case manager and family. She really wanted to find a way for Sawyer to track his progress specifically so he could report back to her in a very systematic fashion, and was also wanting to meet with him more frequently to move to monthly appointments. So all three of those steps, all of these things, all of these options, all of the expertise that people brought to the table led to creating several parameters that everyone agreed on for the shared decisions and the next steps in Sawyer's treatment. Sawyer and his case manager would explore personal medicine and use a decision support tool to keep a mood calendar that actually allowed Sawyer to track daily what wellness strategies he was using and how he felt when he did them. Sawyer's parents would encourage Sawyer to use those tools at home or support him in using them outside of the home, like taking him to the park to walk on the trails or taking him to the library to check out books on movie making and grab a couple rentals he could watch throughout the week, things like that. Sawyer's prescriber agreed to meet more frequently with Sawyer to slowly decrease his medications and to go over his mood and symptom calendar he was tracking. And this was really to ensure his plan was effective and he was doing well, that there wasn't an imminent risk to Sawyer. Sawyer, with the help from his case manager and family, would develop a wellness recovery action plan, which essentially is a relapse prevention plan that helps people identify the things they can do daily to take care of themselves, identifying potential triggers, early warning signs, and having a plan in place of steps that Sawyer could take to get back on track if he noticed any subtle signs of change. So those were the shared decisions that were created from the process of shared decision making. Now, I mentioned throughout Sawyer's story of several areas of personal medicine. And I think when we think of that word medicine, I think it's fair to say that most of us immediately get an image of pills in our mind, right? But what if medicine also represented images of the things in our lives that matter most and enhance not only our purpose in life, but our well-being, right? So we all like to spend time doing things we enjoy that reflect something unique about each of us. Self-care is at the heart of our work, And personal medicine provides a platform for us to really begin exploring and supporting people in recognizing these everyday activities and the potential sources of strength they bring. I'm going to be completely honest. If someone would have just surrounded me with the idea that there were things I could do to take care of myself and promote my wellness besides just waiting for medication to do the work, it would have saved me so much of the ugly stuff I experienced later in life. And that's powerful to help shine the light on what people can do to take care of themselves. And conversations about self-care and empowerment are the foundation of strengths practice. When we have a clear understanding of the reason we do things and the benefit we get from it, man, do we become more likely to incorporate those things into our lives. And oftentimes, personal medicine can actually enhance the effects of pill medicine. You know, while many people have to wait weeks or months to see the benefits of pill medicine, of course, unless benzos here, personal medicine can give us instant results. And it's something that's inherent within all of us. We all have things in our lives that bring meaning, purpose, and a positive sense of self. It's not a concept that's just attributed to people within the system. Personal medicine is something that all of us have and that all of us do to create wellness in our lives. So several examples of Sawyer's personal medicine you heard throughout his story. His interest in team sports and his love of film, those two things created pathways for him to join Special Olympics, to find a job he enjoyed and that he was good at. Walking was a way for Sawyer to clear his thoughts and soothe himself if he felt overwhelmed. And here's the deal. Our system doesn't prescribe these things. And if we're honest, no amount of clinical education or training could have predicted these things would help transform Sawyer's life. They had to come from Sawyer. And all of these things were resources, skills, and strengths that were already within him and that worked together to help Sawyer get the life that he wanted and were incorporated into his plan to get off medications. And finally, decision support tools. So the great thing about ever-evolving technology is that there's so many tools that are becoming available that can improve collaboration and communication between people and their treatment teams. They help individuals explore what matters most and get the information that they need to be able to weigh those options in deciding what's going to be the best decision for their life. I really want you to hone in on the bottom bullet point there. SAMHSA has a free shared decision-making toolkit on their website. The link is there for you to copy and paste. But it is a fabulous resource that has tools, pamphlets, worksheets, a web-based program for people to do on the computer in regards to shared decision-making. So the tools that exist out there, again, are limitless, can really support our work, our practice, and the lives of people and services. And I think we were going to move back to Rick.
Yes, and Rick, I want you to make sure you're looking at your chats. I've been forwarding you questions that I'd love for you to review them for a moment. So,
okay.
Any final references around these resources?
No, do you want me to look at some of the questions yet, or?
Yes, go ahead and review the questions. So thank you for those of you that have been chatting in questions. You've put them in the question box. I have been sending them on to Rick. So Rick, why don't you start at the top and then work through them?
Okay. Well, looks like the first one talks about at our center we offer basic concrete items like socks, clothing, etc. But a person has to continue meeting with the case manager and working on goals in order to receive them. And so it looks like they're just kind of wanting some perspective on thoughts on the difference between incentivizing and coercion. And as a person who did homeless outreach and, was the director of a homeless program as well, we frequently did a lot of things where, we just took blankets out to people or food, and we built that into our budget, and we knew that people may take us up on it or not. And, our program had actually went through several different evolutions. At one point, they were tied to those things, and that people couldn't get certain things unless they did certain things. And I don't know that really helped us move any further in what we were trying to do. And for me, when I was taking over, one of my fundamental questions was that, why don't people want us? Why don't people think that we have something to offer? So I kind of really challenged back to ourselves is that how do we make ourselves relevant so that, when we're off, we don't have to offer something. There's other places that we could help develop in our community for people to get things like socks and food and blankets and stuff like that. But if we choose to offer those, I don't have any problem with like an incentive of like, getting people to notice us. And I think that's really what we kind of did with the blankets and stuff. But it was always something that was freely offered. A lot of it was just to in a sense, bring ourselves into awareness. But there was always this whole thing about that people could accept us or not accept us. And I think focusing more on the thing about our relevancy was the best way that we really starting to engage people, so that it really didn't have anything to do with the socks or the food or the clothing and stuff like that. So my preference is I don't like to tie those things together, but I have no problem using those. And I think that it's just the fundamental question I think to always ask as a program is that why don't people want to engage with us without those things? And if we can find some way to answer that question, we're going to get a lot further along to establishing relevancy than if we think about how to keep those things tied together. There's another question on here, or it looks like a possible concern. It looks like a person who has a son who's diagnosed with schizophrenia, and the whole thing about, information about getting off of medications. And I didn't read the whole thing on here, is that, Sawyer's particular case is going to be different than anyone else's. That was Sawyer's desire, but there was also a lot of things that were explored in terms of, how medications are helpful and how that they aren't. So I really want to be careful that that the goal of any of this is to try to get people off medications. The important thing for me is to really take a good look at in terms of how do we help people in a sense to be able to meet the life that they're wanting to live. And personal medicine is not a replacement for medications, and for a lot of people medications do amazing things. What people probably, if you've noted before about our work here, or our center here, is that probably over half the people that we have work here have the lived experience of mental illness, and people that have experienced a lot of hospitalizations before, people that have spent numerous amounts of time within community mental health centers. But there are also people that we have on our staff that still take medications and see benefits of medications. And so a lot of it is kind of being more transparent about those type of things. Now, where it falls outside of it is when you start attaching things where I talked about the power dynamics of, where people are at imminent risk of being a danger to themselves or others. So, it's not that we're not going to use medications with people, but we have to just be very clear about, in terms of that, if medications are an option, trying to align with people about their reasons of why they might want to take medications. Something that we've seen within shared decision making have been where, a person who would not take an antipsychotic, but would take an they wouldn't take an antipsychotic that was related to why we thought they might have needed to take it, but because the antipsychotic provided sleep, which actually helped them. So sometimes people end up agreeing to do a medication for a completely different reason than the one we put out there. So I don't know if I know how to completely answer it, except for that this whole thing of shared decision making is not to, in a sense, try to get people to do the other side of it, to not take medications, but to really understand about why people might actually do anything. Because even at the same time as if a person takes medications, they either take them because they want to, or they're taking them because they don't feel like they have any other option to. So, there's been times also that I know with the program that I ran that we had a psychiatrist that was willing to do med vacations where it was very structured around that, where people might have a chance just to find out what they were like, not on medications. And there were a lot of people then that decided as a result of that they did want to be on medications. So there's lots of ways that you can do this. The scary thing for me always is that I think what Kelly mentioned is that sometimes just not openly discussing medications can create an environment where people are always at risk for not taking medications or non-adherent, which happens a lot. It's a common problem. And so the question is that, well, how do we help people align? And it may be shifting different things. It may be medications at a lower dose or a different type of medication. It's just a transparent way of discussing it.
Rick, I sent you a couple more questions, but I can read them if you'd like.
Yeah, go ahead.
In terms of talking about self-medication, I know that the speaker said it takes the person to discover this, but as therapists, can we now start suggesting it, or does it have to be 100% self-discovery?
I think it is a full collaboration, and I think anytime that we have knowledge of something, that we can present it out there. It's just like when you think about motivational interviewing, motivational interviewing is not to sway a person in a certain direction, but help the person to see kind of, multiple different kind of vantage points and then to make decisions based, it is a form of shared decision making often. So I see no problem with that. I think it's always the question about, understanding that people have the power then to decide what they want to do with that information. But I think honestly, it's, when you're doing a strengths assessment, you're already going to uncover things that we would call personal medicine. And it really doesn't even, I see the next question on there is about, can we call it personal strategies? I don't think it's the word that even makes the difference. It's the concept of it. And what we find with a lot of people in introducing things like personal medicine is that they use it very collaboratively with medications. Where, sometimes people expect that medications are going to do everything, and we all know that medications will not do everything. It may be that medications open up a person's ability to think a little bit more clear, but the medications don't get the person to the job. They don't help the person get a kid dressed for school in the morning. They don't do these things. So sometimes for people to very understanding what medications can do and what they can't do. And so I think it's a way of us saying is that, are there other things that might be able to help you in this particular area, because it doesn't seem like medications is specifically touching it. I don't know if that's helpful or not, but I think the more that we can just talk openly with people about, their goals and values and stuff, I think that's really important. Let me go on a little bit more, and maybe that'll kind of help to answer some of that in a different way. I'm going to go really quick past this one, since every time that we've done this, we have associated it to a note. And, into that GURP format, here's just a note that takes a peek into the work that was done with the direct service provider with Sawyer, where you kind of see this stuff broken out, where this is a note that, at least under our system, meets all the things of medical necessity, but it also makes a lot of transparency in terms of how decision-making occurred and how they decided the next steps. So I'm not going to go through the entire note, but since you have this copy, it just gives you another reference to how a note might look that incorporates shared decision-making. But I do need to say some more things about these shifts that occurred for Sawyer, a little context. Kelly mentioned the fact that, this was an 8-year kind of journey for a lot of this stuff to happen, and it wasn't just for Sawyer, but was for the entire agency. And, what I think Kelly and I would say about this agency is that they were a very good agency overall. They really wanted to do the right thing. Recovery was definitely a language that they used. But there were also times when they started questioning about, were they doing things that were completely aligning with recovery? And so during this 8-year period, this agency also started implementing strengths model case management to high fidelity. So now not only, you have Sawyer who's verbalizing things that he wants, but now with the worker using a strengths assessment, it even more so puts into focus what Sawyer's wanting. And it was also through the strengths assessment that started revealing strengths that contributed to his wellness, those things that we now recognize as personal medicine. If you look at his strengths assessment, those things start to jump off the page. So if they wouldn't have been doing strengths model case management, then this may have turned out differently. I'm not saying it would have, but but these were contributing factors that the agency was going through. Another one is that this agency started implementing common ground shared decision making, and you know, this is a program that's developed by Pat Deegan. Not every agency is going to be able to afford or have this, but I do have to provide the context that this agency was doing this. And so pretty routinely that people were starting to develop what they call power statements, which is where those kind of goal and value statements kind of come out, where that the prescriber is actually looking at what Sawyer wants, and it's something that's right out there in front of them before they even make decisions. And you know, Kelly mentioned the how I am doing scale, and you know, you don't have to have common ground to do a how am I doing scale, but it really is just a checklist of, you know, from appointment to appointment to where are people doing in certain areas, so that it's not just that are you taking medications, but how are you doing in these various areas. And also becoming, you know, concerns with medications. So there's a part of that program where, you know, they're asking people their experience of medications. And once again, you don't have to have common ground to do this, to talk with people about medications. And then the whole personal medicine concept comes out of that. So these are important kind of things for me to mention that provide a little context that this entire organization was struggling with a shift of going towards shared decision making, but that involved lots of larger shifts inside of that. So some of you may have that question, well, what if others don't share my view of shared decision making? And I'm just going to leave you with a few small things to keep in mind. Even if you're not doing a lot of other stuff, there are already decisions that are being made that are within your control. You know, you could look at the thing with Sawyer that, you know, it's not the worker's decision to say whether the person should or should not take medications. And as you saw, that was really something between Sawyer and the family and the prescriber. But there are decisions that were in control of things between the worker, like and the client, which was looking at, you know, personal medicine, exploring those. You know, people have goals, values, and preferences, whether we help make these explicit or not. So we don't make them go away by not talking about it. It's just that we don't have the discomfort of not hearing it, but they still have it, and people are still going to make decisions based on those things. And validating these things does not commit us to anything. You know, just because that we recognize that Sawyer feels a certain way about something doesn't mean that we're committed to have to specifically do something about it. But validation is one important part that you can do. Also, taking the time to explore and understand people's experience is not a search for this ultimate truth objective. So we don't have to be so nervous that, you know, once we go down a certain road, that that's now going to be truth with a capital T. But it is a person's perspective. It's how they view it, and it may be completely different from family. It may be completely different from other professionals or the prescriber. But we can help people to vocalize that, and it doesn't commit us, once again, to anything. Helping people explore options doesn't commit us to any particular choice. You know, and when the worker kind of helped Sawyer look at a lot of things, you also have to remember that one of the things that Sawyer also valued was his mom, or actually his parents together, but particularly his mom. So therefore, it's like, you know, those options also for Sawyer had to take into account that his mom was still involved. So it's an important thing. There's lots of things that go into a choice. So our role really is to help people navigate these decisions based on a full range of desired goals, values, preferences, et cetera, that, you know, if family members are involved and the person wants their family involved in decisions, it will involve the family. So with that, is there any final questions?
The individual had the question about the use of personal medicine and they may be moving away from medication. She just says she apologized for her last question, but it's a process and emotional and trying life journey as a family. So I think that's a really good underscoring of everything you've just said.
Yeah, you know, as a person who has experienced mental health services but also been a family member, you know, I completely understand that completely struggle. And it's just like with Sawyer parents. You know, it wasn't the mental health center that was there at 3 a.m. when there was mental health crises. It wasn't the mental health system that had to sometimes respond when decisions didn't go so well. So family are very invested into this. And so, you know, I think that when family are involved, we have to understand multiple perspectives. But, you know, what I always go with clients is, you know, when they're wanting to make decisions, is that who else is important in terms of making your decision? You know, because people as adults do have an option that they could say, well, you know what, I really don't care about my family, I'm going to make this decision. And if that's the case, they'll probably do it anyway. But a lot of people will say that they do want connection with family, they do want connection with other people, and so therefore what they think also matters within that decision that they make. So, you know, I know we've opened up a lot of things. These are not completely simple, but I really hope that what I've opened up in this is just really looking at the multiple things that may be involved in decisions, and we still have a lot to struggle through, and there's nothing here that we've said that applies in every single instance. Everything is kind of idiosyncratic, and you really have to take the context, just like we've done with Sawyer. Those decisions were all made within a context, and that context will not be the same for every other client that we work with.
Well, Rick, at this point, we had a wonderful comment from Diane Lucas, who said this is a fabulous discussion. And I think, you know, Diane, we were sure hoping that that would be what happened here, is that we open up a conversation and have some discussion and create some possibilities. So really appreciate your feedback on that. Let's talk about what we're going to do next in our webinar series. We've got 2 more sessions. Obviously, one of the best things you can do to answer your questions is try it. So we said that before, recommend it again. Next session, we'll be continuing to talk about achieving goals and advancing recovery. Next slide. Some of the topics that we'll be covering are, you know, coming back to the personal recovery plan. What are the key elements? How do we get the steps broken down into small measurable steps? You know, personal medicine, how can that be applied in there? How do we evaluate progress and update the plan at each visit? Not every year, not every 3 months, but every visit. What are system supports for goal achievement? We got to keep coming back to that. How's the system going to support the success of the individuals we serve? How do we build in their natural resources, their environment in which they live, that can be brought to bear on helping them achieve the life that they're seeking? And we'll also be introducing group supervision, which is one of the most exciting system supports, very doable methodology to make the strengths model, the strengths practice successful and viable, and something that just revitalizes the work that we do, which is hard, important, you know, and very life-changing for the folks that we serve. So May 4th, we'll be covering these topics. It'll be session number 5. If you have any questions that come up between now and the next session, please share them. We'll make sure to cover them in the next session, if not via email. Put your notes into the evaluation that follows this. Kelly and Rick, thank you so much for a really wonderful discussion. Great sharing around your own practice experience, the story of Sawyer, and you know what this all means in the context of advancing recovery and using the strengths model. So thank you both for your fabulous presentation, and to our participants for staying in for session number 4. I really appreciate those that have stuck this all the way 4 months into this. So we look forward to 1 month from now.
All right, thanks everyone.
Thanks everyone. Take care.
Well.